is leading us into our section on the Bible. Even in the Old Testament, before God gave Israel a king, the tribe of priests was not the tribe of warriors. In fact, the priests were to keep their hands clean. They could not enter the Holy of Holies without being clean. Again, and I will repeat this later, they could not enter the Holy of Holies without being clean. Even though God anointed David to be king after he had anointed King Saul, and King Saul had messed up, he did not urge David to overthrow King Saul. In fact, he allowed that to happen on its own. He allowed regular politics to take its course. Even when Israel was under a foreign rule, they followed the laws of the land as long as they did not conflict and interfere with the laws of God. Now we're going to, but our best option, our best example of what the Bible says about this separation of church and state actually happens in the New Testament. The first one being Jesus himself. During Jesus' last visit to Jerusalem before he was betrayed by Judas, the Pharisees thought they would try to catch him up. They thought they would try to trip him up on something. So it was tax time, and the Pharisees came to Jesus asking this question: who should we pay our taxes to? Because we are Jews in a Roman-controlled area. Who should we pay our taxes to? God or Caesar? Jesus asked them, whose inscription's on that coin? I apologize for that. I had a text come through. So, Jesus asked, whose inscription's on that coin? They said, Caesar's. Jesus then said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Give God what is God's. In other words, now, God gave us a brain to think with. God gave us a common sense. And the Bible says to read and understand the word with wisdom. Okay, that doesn't mean that we just look at what it says for face value. Okay, we have to use common sense. We have to use wisdom. Wisdom says that, well, there was a reason for him saying this. And he was saying God's jurisdiction doesn't overlap Caesar's jurisdiction. That's what he was saying. In fact, he was saying, because that inscription is on there, you're to give that to Caesar. God doesn't want your money. In fact, the tithe and what was always brought as sacrifice had never anything to do with currency. Currency, keep in mind, currency is a man-made system. Not God. God didn't make currency. God made the materials that we make currency out of, but God did not make currency or make the system of currency. That was a man-made system. God's system has been and always will be bartering. They would bring livestock as sacrifice. You would bring a tenth of your fruits of your first fruits to God. You didn't bring your money, because the church doesn't have it. And, well, I'll put it this way. In the old days, the church didn't have anything they needed money for. Okay? The church wasn't supposed to have all these expensive cars and all these big, majestic cathedrals. They weren't supposed to have that when it was first started. When it was first started, they were actually, the people were supposed to sell their possessions, give the money to the poor, and then they would come together, worship God, do all of those things. Had nothing to do with currency. So when Jesus says, whose inscription's on that? He was saying, yeah, Caesar made that. That coin belongs to Caesar. You give the taxes to Caesar. But he was also saying, you also need to give God what is God's. What is God's? Several different things. That's neither here nor there about that. That's a very, very big other discussion. So, we have Jesus promoting the separation of church and state. Now we go forward to Paul. One of Paul's letters, and I think Jesus had even said this himself as well. You are to follow the laws of the land until they interfere with the laws of God. Paul also said that all things are lawful, but not all things are beneficial. In other words, there are things that are lawful, that are okay to do according to the law, according to the governing law, but they're not beneficial for your spiritual life. In our day, that would be very similar to drinking. That would be very similar to drugs, to, theme parks. All of these things are very lawful to do, well, at least on the legal substances, legal drugs. They're very legal, but they're not beneficial for your spiritual life. So what he was saying was that God is not going to dictate the things that don't benefit or hurt your spiritual life. God's not going to dictate, again I'm going to say it, God is not going to dictate things, what you do and don't do, if they don't affect your spiritual life. If they don't affect your spiritual life one way or the other, then, as long as it's lawful, there's nothing against it. Paul also says that we are to pray for our leaders. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but if the church would spend even a half as much time in the prayer closet, if they would do it the way that it was supposed to be designed, which is you're supposed to pray for your leadership instead of protesting it, their hands wouldn't be as dirty, and they would have more time for the work of God.